Now for today's program. Dr. Suzanne Maloney is the Vice President and Director of the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution, where her research focuses on Iran and Persian Gulf energy. She is a leading voice on United States policy toward Iran and the broader Middle East, testifying before Congress, briefing policymakers, and engaging with government, nonprofit organizations, and corporations. Suzanne has advised both Democratic and Republican administrations on Iran policy and has authored or edited 3 books on Iran and has published numerous book chapters and articles in a variety of academic and policy journals, as well as news media such as the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Foreign Affairs. Aaron David Miller is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and a former State Department Middle East analyst and negotiator in Republican and Democratic administrations. Aaron is a frequent commentator on CNN, MSNBC, NPR, and BBC, and his articles have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, and Foreign Affairs. Robert Siegel was the senior host of NPR's award-winning news magazine All Things Considered for 30 years. He was awarded the Edward Murrow Lifetime Achievement Award in Journalism and has been honored with 3 silver batons from Alfred I. DuPont Columbia University, as well as the American Bar Association Silver Gavel Award. Currently, he hosts Navigating the New Abnormal, a series of web seminars sponsored by American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. Robert is a special contributor to Moment Magazine and serves on the advisory board for Moment's Daniel Pearl Investigative Journalism Initiative. Please welcome Aaron David Miller, Suzanne Maloney, and Robert Siegel.
And thank you, Suzanne. The aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln and its attendant vessels have been moved to within easy reach of Iran. And President Trump calls this carrier group a massive armada. He has demanded that Iran agree to a nuclear program, a deal on its nuclear program that would be more restrictive than the one the U.S. walked out on. And it would also cover Iranian production of missiles. Iran has threatened a regional war if it is attacked, and there are high-level U.S.-Iranian talks tomorrow in Oman. Suzanne Maloney, Suzanne Maloney, excuse me. It's one of those days when I feel especially fortunate that we have an Iran hand on board. Let me ask you the very important question: Do you think that the war with Iran, is about to resume? And if so, to what end?
Thanks very much, Robert, and thanks to Suzanne and to Moment Magazine for convening this discussion. I'm really glad to be part of it. Obviously, Iran is very much in the news these days. I think it's very likely that we will see U.S. strikes on Iran, although obviously we'll have to play things out at the negotiating table first. But I would take a step back and say, what's incredible to me in many respects is how we arrived at this particular moment. Obviously, Iran is much weaker than it has been in many years, certainly since weaker than any time since the United States invaded Iraq and changed the government there and really changed the complexion of Middle East politics and Iran's position in the region. And Iran has absorbed, unprecedented American and Israeli strikes, particularly the 12-day war back in June of last year, which really did disrupt its nuclear infrastructure quite considerably, buried underground large quantities of highly enriched uranium. For the first time, those strikes meant that Iran has no longer been enriching uranium for the first time in more than 2 decades. And that is an incredible setback for a regime that has invested billions of dollars and decades of time and investment and infrastructure in developing an industrial scale nuclear program that would enable it to make the decision to have a nuclear weapons capability. We don't know that it had arrived at that point, but all signs of that program are completely only in one direction, one of a nuclear weapons program. And so, one might have imagined that President Trump could sit back on his laurels, having, essentially done the deed that American policymakers have debated for now several decades about whether or not a strike would be effective in setting back Iran's nuclear program. And instead, we are here once again, both at the negotiating table with the sort of Damocles of this massive armada that the president has been tweeting about, simply because the president, in the middle of the night, in the early days of January of this year, as Iranians came to the streets to protest against their government, promised that the United States was locked and loaded and would rescue the protesters. He made those first tweets only about 24 hours before the operation in Venezuela, where the United States deposed the Maduro regime. And yet there was no real capability to undertake military action, no real capability to help the protesters in any meaningful way. And so by putting American credibility on the line, President Trump really made it almost inevitable that we would have to essentially shift gears and suddenly bring the Abraham Lincoln from the Indo-Pacific into the Middle East area of responsibility to enable him to make good on those threats. And so with the threat of potential military action looming, I think all sides realized this was moving in a very dangerous direction. The prospect of negotiations was pushed very heavily by a number of regional parties, including the Turks, the Saudis, and others. So we have negotiations tomorrow in Oman, and that in and of itself, there's a lot of interesting dynamics there. But I think there's really very little likelihood of an agreement of any kind between the Iranians and the United States, simply because what the Trump administration is looking for are precisely the things that the Iranians have said now for decades they will not do: give up the nuclear program, end their ballistic missile program, forswear their support to proxies around the region, and provide some kind of a pathway to greater democracy within the country. And so it's hard to imagine there's going to be a deal, given how much the president himself is personally invested in this issue, and given the promises that he made over the course of many weeks around readiness to strike Iran. I suspect we may see some kind of an exchange of fire, for which the Americans try to hit Iran, but not hit so hard that the Iranians strike back in a really devastating way.
Well, just not to let this point, to make sure that I get you straight here, what's driving all this was the tweet, was the tweeted policy, President Trump's personal support for the protests in Iran. What has followed since in the movement of the fleet is actually driven by that.
Yes, I think that, this precise moment has been precipitated by the president's tweets in the early hours of the morning back in early January, and then followed up over the course of the days and weeks that followed, as Iranians poured into the streets in larger numbers. The president encouraged Iranians to seize the institutions of the state. He told them that help is on the way. And of course, that help has never come. But in part, I assume, because of those tweets, the United States began what has been a very public, conscious effort to move a lot of military assets to the region to pre-position the kind of force that would enable the United States to undertake a massive strike against Iran.
Well, let me put this both to you and to Aaron. I'll put it first to Aaron David Miller. Let's assume that there are strikes. There are various possibilities, as Suzanne Maloney has said. It could be a calibrated set of strikes, not so powerful that they would invite Iranian retaliation. They could be strikes that are somehow aimed at advancing the cause of regime change or regime decapitation a la Venezuela, or just setting back whatever kind of progress the Iranians may have made in trying to rebuild their nuclear program over the past half a year. What do you think the aim of the strikes would be? And do you think that someone in the administration knows what the aim of the strikes would be?
It's an intriguing question. My own view of when the U.S. puts its men and women in harm's way, the questions that need to be asked are not only can we do it, but should we do it? Mm-hmm. And what is the objective? And what are the costs and consequences? We invaded Iraq with insufficient forces, a woeful misunderstanding of Iraqi politics, country roughly the size of California. Population-wise, where the standard for victory in Afghanistan as well was never could we win, but when could we leave? I'm not comparing Iran and Iraq and Afghanistan, the two longest wars in American history. But you really have to wonder if the president does, first of all, he has to avoid the Obama red line problem, which for Trump would be an abject horror if he is compared to President Obama, because who failed to strike over the CW sites.
Yeah, this was when
Syria.
President Obama said that the use of chemical weapons would be a red line, implying that
right.
would prompt the U.S.
So
to get involved.
let's assume, for sake of argument, that the president simply wants to discharge that responsibility. Well, the Saudi defense minister, Khalid bin Salman, the brother of the putative crown prince, said that a strike might actually that didn't fundamentally do damage might embolden the regime. Yeah. Or if he didn't strike, it would embolden the regime. So so discharge the red line problem. That's one option. Number two is weaken the forces of repression by going after IRGC besieged military targets.
These are the Revolutionary Guards.
Right. Or number three, don't settle for a one-off or a two-day off, but fundamentally seek to not change the regime. There is absolutely no way that airstrikes can change the regime, but you could presumably, Suzanne's the expert here, you could cause a degree of fracture if in fact the campaign was sustained. I just don't know what the president's risk threshold was. One last point. They told him not to withdraw from the JCPOA because it would be the end of the world. Well, the end of the world didn't come. Then they told him not to try to strike Qasem Soleimani, the head of the IRGC. The end of the world didn't come there. Then they told him, don't strike the nuke sites because you're going to end up in a regional war. Well, there was no regional war. Mm-hmm. So Trump's sense is that he has a certain margin for action now.
Suzanne Maloney, what do you think the purpose of those strikes might be, if there are strikes?
Well, I think the purpose would be to try to further set back Iran's capability to cause harm to its own population, as well as to threaten its neighbors, whether through its nuclear program, through its ballistic missile program, or through its support for proxies. And certainly we could do some harm, particularly to the ballistic missile program, which the Iranians have been intently rebuilding since the June war. And that is a real concern to Israel and to other neighbors in the region, because Iran has demonstrated increasing capability and increasing willingness to use those ballistic missiles directly against Israel and against targets, including the American base in Qatar. And so that's a real threat. And this might just be an opportunity to set that back a little bit, to mow the lawn, so to speak. But I think the challenge that we have here is, and I agree exactly with the description that Aaron has just articulated about, what the theory of the case may be for the Trump administration in terms of willingness to take a risk, given that its risks have been largely validated with respect to Iran over both the first and this current term. The concern I would have, and that I would hope American policymakers would have, and certainly that Iran's neighbors have, is that this is a regime that is just authorized unprecedented force against its own population, slaughtered what maybe tens of thousands of people within the span of just a couple of days, to put down protests that, while powerful and inspirational, were really not at a point that they could threaten the regime's hold on power yet. Yeah. And yet, because they felt backed into a corner, because this is a regime that is aging, whose credibility and legitimacy has been eroded by its failure to deliver a better life for its people, they engaged in what I think even those of us who spent time in Iran, who believe we understand a little bit about this system and about the people, might have believed. I never would have believed that Iranian troops would fire on their own people with the ferocity that we saw over the course of those few days in January. And so a regime that is that desperate, that sees the stakes as existential, even if this is intended to be a calibrated strike, a strike that simply sets back some capabilities, or a minor decapitation, not a full-scale regime change set of strikes. The Iranians may not see it that way. And if they're prepared to use unprecedented force against innocent protesters, I would be prepared to assume that they will use unprecedented force against American positions in the region, against our partners and allies, both in the Gulf and in Israel. And whether the president believes in the Pottery Barn rule of you break it, you own it, and we know he doesn't care about nation building. If there is a sustained conflict in the region, the United States will have to maintain forces there. The United States will have to remain invested there because of those partnerships and allies that depend on us. We have been prepared to walk away, perhaps in Europe and even to in some parts of the Indo-Pacific. But I see no evidence that this administration, even with its disdain for our alliance structure around the world, would leave Israel and the Saudis and the Emiratis and others in the region at the mercy of an Iran that is simply intent on disruption and destruction against its neighbors.
Yeah, you are taking me back here, back when I believe it was Colin Powell enunciated the Pottery Barn rule. We checked with Pottery Barn, actually. They claimed that that was not their rule, that it wasn't there. At NPR, this was.
Robert, just for the record, I interviewed Tom Friedman last week on my show, and I raised this issue because we were talking about Iran, and I said, Colin Powell, who I worked for. Tom said, no, Aaron, it wasn't Colin Powell. I was the one who came up with the Pottery
It was
Barn.
Tom who came up with it. Yeah.
And it was Tom. Absolutely. It was Tom.
Just before we leave this one question of end, are we at risk here of doing what many people say we did in Hungary in 1956, when there's a government that actually tries to pull away from the Warsaw Pact, from Soviet control, and the encouragement they received from Radio Free Europe was so enthusiastic that a lot of Hungarians were convinced the United States was on the way, that they were locked and loaded, and there was tremendous disappointment when it became clear that the U.S. wasn't about to start World War III over what was happening in Budapest.
I think it was morally unconscionable. None of his predecessors, Republican or Democrat, got out in front by basically saying things like, help is on the way, seize your institutions, we're going to hit them hard. I think it's morally and ethically unconscionable for the President of the United States. Demonstrators are already in the streets. He didn't put them there. But to encourage them to face the murderous rage of a repressive regime, and then essentially, we may be talking 20, 30,000 dead, and then essentially to do nothing. So now the president is in a position, even if he conducts massive strikes, it is the people of Iran that are likely to continue to suffer. I think it's an untenable situation for him to be in. Yes, I think there's a hungry model here, or president.
I will once again agree with Aaron. I think there's already a profound sense of betrayal on the part of many Iranians, and certainly many in the diaspora as well. We know from at least anecdotal evidence that there were people who went to the streets with the sense that there was a greater force that was coming to step in to protect them. We also can surmise that the regime might have escalated its own violent reaction because of the fear that the United States was somehow involved in some kind of a soft regime change effort. As a result of the president's tweets. And we also know that he made those tweets. They weren't the basis of a, sort of principals or deputies committee deliberation that was part of a large interagency assessment of what are the risks and possible advantages of this posture. It wasn't a policy decision. He made these tweets of his own personal volition with really no ability to back up what he was committing and what he was promising. And that is precisely what we do not want American leaders ever to do, because it is that trust in America's word. It is that belief that America can deliver on what it promises, that has made us so influential around the world. I would also note, of course, that in Iran, the sense of disappointment with American policy runs very deep. I would contest the typical historical narrative around 1953 and the coup that overthrew the elected prime minister at that time and reinstated the Shah on his throne at that point in time. It has been somewhat glorified by Hollywood and certainly even within Iran by the narrative in the mythology around it. But it is true that the actions of a small number of American intelligence operatives with a small amount of money who contributed to a very contested internal political situation in Iran led to a narrative that for decades dominated this sense of evil doing by the United States and the machinations of an America that subverted Iranian democracy. The sense that thousands of people have lost loved ones as a result of these protests. The blame lies squarely with the Islamic Republic. But America's role in this will not be forgotten, and it is, at this point at least, a shameful one.
Well, as I mentioned, the Iranian Supreme Leader mentioned a regional war, be Iran's response to being attacked, which brings us to the region. A few years ago, a regional war that Iran was talking about implied that it would probably involve the very well-armed and pretty well-trained Hezbollah militia that controls southern Lebanon. It would have an ally in Hamas in Gaza. It had an ally in Syria, in the Assad family that ran Syria. That's not the situation today, and I'd like to hear about what the two of you make of conditions in those countries and in well, let's start with Syria, which is now it has a completely new government. President welcomed at the White House, remarkably. Is it in charge of Syria? Is the Syrian government in charge of its territory? Aaron, do you want to?
It's a work in progress. Integration of the Druze, suspicion on the part of the Christian population, and of course the Kurdish problem, which is frankly, surprisingly, it's still going to be contentious, but the integration in the Northeast has begun. I think the Kurds, once again, Suzanne talked about betrayal, the Kurds once again are feeling betrayed by CENTCOM and the U.S. military, which partnered with them to defeat ISIS, but made it unmistakably clear, maybe the U.S. military didn't stick to the talking points, that support for the Kurds would be transitional, tactical, and temporary. The Kurds now find themselves, the SDF, find themselves losing most of their assets in northeast Syria, with some exceptions. So on Syria, the process of integration with the Kurds has started. It'll be messy. The Druze present another problem. In Sueda, there have been horrible abuses of government forces and counter abuses by Druze militias. The Israelis have a stake and have maintained contact with the Druze for any number of reasons. The broader question on Syria, and Robert, we won't know the answer to this for quite some time to come, is whether or not Syria will prove to be the exception of an Arab state that overthrew an Arab dictator, Ben Ali in Tunisia, Mubarak in Egypt, Abdullah Saleh in Yemen. Those cases did not end well for the Arab Springers. You either have bad governance, Libya, by the way, the overthrow of Gaddafi, you have bad governance, no governance, or the return of authoritarians. Question I ask myself is whether Syria will prove to be the exception. Will Ahmed Shara, criticized by his detractors as being a jihadi in a suit, is he as pragmatic as he appears to be? I mean, one last point. We encouraged under Republican Democratic administrations the Syrians to have high-level direct talks with the Israelis. They mostly refused. You now have, under American auspices, senior-level negotiations between Ahmed Shara, Syrian foreign minister, and close confidence of the current Israeli prime minister, talking not about return to the Golan Heights. That's the amazing thing, but about a security agreement. So I would, in a region full of desperation and hopelessness, this is a potentially bright spot.
a bright Suzanne Maloney, thoughts about Syria? Do you see bright spots there?
Well, I'll echo Aaron's assessment. And, in some respects, I think Syria is already the exception being that it is a bright spot in a region where that has been, painfully hard to find in recent years. And it has challenged, I think, all of us who have looked at some of these very authoritarian and extremely brutal governments and presumed that they will stand despite the fact that they are essentially governing failed states, as Bashar Assad was. Not even governing, of course. He was presiding over, at least in theory, and certainly not always in practice, a failed state. But the timeline for those failed states, unfortunately, has often been far too protracted, and the ability to predict their demise has been incredibly difficult, which is why I think nobody anticipated what happened in late 2024. And it has been remarkable that we have now passed more than a year of a newly independent Syria outside of the control of the Assad family after decades of misrule. And that despite some considerable perils internally and as well as in terms of its relationships with its more powerful neighbors, so far Ashara seems to be managing reasonably well. And there is, beginnings of investment going in. There's the beginnings of reconstruction going on. Many refugees who presume they might never see their country again have been able to return. And that is an incredibly hopeful story. It doesn't mean it can happen everywhere. It certainly doesn't mean it will last, especially as Aaron highlighted, there are these internal tensions that have external forces very much in play that can flare up in ways that are quite dangerous. But so far, Shara himself seems to be navigating things reasonably wisely. And I think that some of that has to do with the fact that there are a number of external players that have become the most important players in the region that appear to be invested in sustaining his rule, and that includes Turkey, that includes the Saudis in particular, but also, at least in this case, the Emiratis and the Israelis, who prefer to see a Syria that is at least on the pathway to a different future than the horrific, violent, and depraved leadership of Bashar Assad.
Well, so much for our bright spot. Next door in Lebanon, Hezbollah sent a lot of men into Syria to fight a losing cause, trying to keep Assad in power. That failed, and now the Israelis have pushed them away from the border, I gather. What are they still? Well, I think it was Aaron who said they're down but not out. What would you say?
I think that's very true in terms of the characterization of Hezbollah. I mean, they have been badly battered by incredibly savvy attacks by the Israelis and the decapitation of the leadership, not just on one occasion, but on multiple occasions over the course of the past 18 months. But this is an organization that's got almost 50 years of history, that has some real connections in Lebanese politics, and it is a force within a very, very weak state. And despite a lot of efforts to strengthen that state, both economically and militarily, to compete effectively with the influence of Hezbollah, it is still an uneven story at this point. The Israelis are dissatisfied with the pace and scope of disarmament of Hezbollah. The Iranians have, come to this. They have significant obstacles to restoring Hezbollah to its former strength, but they have been through a narrative like this before in the aftermath of the 2006 war, which of course was far less destructive, but still a moment where many thought that it was the beginning of the end for Hezbollah. They were able to not just rearm, but they were able to create a deterrent force of tens of thousands of missiles. Has very sophisticated rockets and missiles on Israel's borders. And that's what they're going to try to do again, because that is their trump card for preserving themselves and protecting themselves against attacks from Israel. So the story's not over in Lebanon. We haven't yet found the heroic figure who can somehow bring the state back to relevance and overpower the influence of Hezbollah. And unfortunately, I think it's unlikely the balance is unlikely to tip anytime soon.
Aaron, thoughts on?
No, I think Suzanne has it exactly right. I mean, there are a lot of hopes. The Lebanese political class has been freed up to an extent as a consequence of Hezbollah's diminishment and its hollowing out. The Lebanese class is also very worried about civil war, and as Suzanne points out, among Palestinians. Hezbollah is the most powerful, preeminent security and military actor still, and there's a great concern about pushing Hezbollah too far. Could you end up with fractures within the Lebanese armed forces, which is predominantly Shia? So Lebanon, another work in progress, it joined, sadly, a number of other Arab states, Yemen, Libya, that are dysfunctional. Not failed states, but having problems coping. And, when I look around the region, Robert, I see, with the exception of the Gulf, the three most powerful actors in the region, in my view, even with Iran being substantially weakened, are the three non-Arabs. The three non-Arabs, Turkey, Israel, and Iran, all have tremendous economic potential, all have sophisticated militaries, intelligence organizations. One's a member of NATO, one's the U.S. closest ally in the United States. One is a pariah, Iran, according to some, but I don't know if Suzanne agrees. I think the Iranians, in whatever form they evolve, will be, along with the Israelis and the Turks, keepers. These three states have extraordinary potential. Challenges, but extraordinary potential in the face of a weak Arab world. Syria, Iraq, and Egypt, the three most powerful Arab states that competed for influence and power, frankly, I think they're all sort of offline.
Suzanne, you agree with that?
I agree with that, but I would say put one little bit of doubt around what the future of Iran looks like. I mean, we have known an Iran that has been incredibly powerful and able to rebound from tremendous setbacks. This regime is, I think, maybe in a different position today. We don't know where it's going. The economy has failed. There isn't enough water. The people are willing to risk their lives to demand not just better policies or freer elections, but actually systemic change. And they've been repeatedly vocal. The most recent protests in January were the fourth time in about 6 or 8 years where the Iranians have come to the streets in really large numbers across the country, and not just with slogans of political change, but really demanding the end of the regime. And so it is, I think there's a scenario in which Iran, the Islamic Republic, somehow survives because there isn't an immediate alternative that anyone can identify or advance an outcome for. But it survives essentially as Bashar Assad did, presiding over a declining power and with very few friends or influence in the world. We saw this during the June War, despite the fact that Iran ostensibly has strategic partnerships with China and Russia. Neither one of them came to its defense. They have helped to rearm it. They have taken advantage of its desperation in the case of the Chinese to get a lot of oil at very low prices. But they're not going to invest themselves in sustaining this regime in any way. So I think there is a possibility that Iran does fade in some respects in terms of its relevance. I also think there's a different dynamic happening in and across the Arab world, which is, yes, the traditional Arab powers of the past century are no more, but there are new Arab powers, and they are exerting their influence in new and very interesting ways. And here I would point to both, not just the Gulf as a whole, but the fact that what we see is a competition evolving within the Gulf. Particularly between the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates, which appear to have created their own, blocks to some extent. There's a lot of shared interest, a lot of cooperation and brotherly friendliness between Riyadh and Abu Dhabi. But there is also quite obviously, whether it's in Yemen, in the Horn of Africa, potentially in Syria and elsewhere, some sense of rivalry and even a bit of obviously different interests at play.
Well, this brings us to Gaza and to Israel's position in Gaza and Hamas's position in Gaza. Um, Aaron, what what do you make of the position we're at right now? Half the place is still under control of Hamas. They haven't been disarmed.
I
The
mean,
Israelis, yes, go ahead.
right. No, I mean, I'll make a point I've been making publicly and will continue to make publicly because and again, this current president, in my judgment, is undermining the norms, the institutions, the values of so much about this country. And yet, 20 Israeli hostages alive, 28 bodies of those who are not. The end of the war as we've come to know it doesn't mean over 500 Palestinians have been killed since the October 9 ceasefire, and more will die, I suspect. But the kind of war that Israel waged for now is over. The humanitarian situation is still very grim, but at least on the food insecurity, it has improved somewhat. And none of this would have been possible had not an American president done what none of his Republican or Democratic predecessors ever did. None of the men I worked for, Jimmy Carter to Bush 43, ever would have said to an Israeli prime minister, either you accept this plan and end the war, or we will walk away from you. And Benjamin Netanyahu was uniquely vulnerable. He needs Donald Trump to secure his most important victory, which is to prevail in elections, whether they occur in October when the government goes to term or likely before then. He needs Trump not as a bystander, but as an active participant. An American president, frankly, is more popular in Israel by far than the current Israeli prime minister. So the first phase is implemented. The problem, Robert, is that the two core questions that need to be addressed, I think will be incredibly challenging. Who or what is going to govern Gaza, and who or what is going to provide the security which will allow surging of humanitarian assistance and reconstruction? And those two questions involve galactic lifts on the part of two parties, Hamas as an organization and the current Netanyahu government, that has no interest in answering those questions, according to the terms that the Trump administration and others have set. So I worry Gaza will be divided into two, dysfunctional, at least for now, and sporadically violent.
Suzanne?
I think it's hard to argue with that assessment, and I give full credit to the administration for actually getting to the ceasefire that so many had wanted for such a long time, and to achieving the return of all of the hostages and the bodies of those who perished while they were being held or before they were taken to Gaza on October 7th. That is an important and essential accomplishment. But we have to be, I think, attentive to the fact that a limbo situation is what brought us to the escalation of the conflict, and a continued limbo in which those in Gaza are living in utter misery, dying at about half the rate they were dying before the ceasefire. Yeah. But really not in a position to rebuild in any significant way, not in a position to escape the yoke of Hamas, which, as Aaron said, is determined to remain armed, and really with no prospects for a better life whatsoever. The likelihood of additional radicalization remains quite high. This, I think, is combined with the trends that we're seeing on the West Bank, which in many respects can be understood as creeping annexation. And I think overall there needs to be a concerted effort to try to drive toward the end state that many aspired to decades ago, and that has been so difficult to achieve, which is a world in which both peoples can live in peace and security, prosperity and dignity. And what that world looks like may be very different than it did at the outset of Oslo, but it is not what we're seeing today. And I think that, it's not clear to me that there's anybody on the American side that can or will invest the effort that will be required to bring the parties together to push for the unthinkable concessions on the part of a group like Hamas to actually disarm, and the concessions that would be required on the part of those within the Israeli political establishment to create the conditions for some kind of a different outcome for both the West Bank and Gaza. And without the United States leadership, as much as an important role as regional players have had, and certainly those in Europe have had at different points in this conflict over the years, I think American leadership is still central, and I just don't see that kind of detailed investment of effort that Aaron was a part of for so long, and that has been critical to to addressing this conflict.
You've mentioned Turkey a couple of times. Is Turkey well suited to the very unenviable task of trying to police Gaza or guarantee its safety, something which the Israelis are very much against, but they seem to be the one country in the neighborhood with a professional army, a NATO ally. Is it inconceivable to you that they would commit to Gaza if they were permitted to do so?
I mean, the broader question, Robert, is whether or not any Arab security force or Turkish security force or the Azeris or the Indonesians, all the countries that have been mentioned, as part of a potential international stabilization force, any of them would deploy to Gaza without a fundamental understanding that Hamas would not challenge them and would agree to a process of decommissioning and demilitarization. Can you imagine Arab peacekeepers and Turkish peacekeepers on the ground with Israelis still operating against Hamas, killing Palestinians, and in the process civilians as well, as they've done in their efforts to strike Hamas commanders in recent days?
Yeah.
Or Arab or Turkish peacekeepers either killing Palestinians themselves or holding Israel's coat while the Israelis do it? So the broader issue is not who would be a part of this force. It's under what circumstances would such a force be able to deploy? Is it peace enforcing? Is it stabilization? It took 7 years, beginning in 1998 with the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, until 2005 for the decommissioning process in Northern Ireland to take root. And then the paramilitaries on the Protestant side and the IRA were offered power sharing role in governance.
Mm-hmm.
Hamas is being, rightly, in my judgment, shown the door, or worse, at the end of this decommissioning process. So it's very hard to see how you move forward. If there is any deployment of international force, it will be in the 53% of Gaza that the Israelis now control, not in the 47% that is still a free fire zone.
Do we think that Hamas is satisfied with the status quo? That is this about as much as they want? A chunk of Gaza where they rule and where they, from which they might base a couple of attacks and sustain a couple of attacks. Suzanne, do you think that that's okay by the leadership of Hamas?
Well, look, Hamas should not exist at this point in time, given the determination of the Israeli government to evict Hamas. That was the one first and foremost goal of the war that was fought. And the Hamas has survived, and I would imagine some of that mentality is similar to the Iranians. That once you've survived, what most learned assessments would have assumed was the unthinkable. That they may harbor greater aspirations to try to represent the entirety of the Palestinian people. I can't imagine under these circumstances that would have much purchase, but they have been awfully hard to eradicate and even harder to disarm.
Yes, that I must say you're very persuasive. Although the only nagging bright spot that I shouldn't even raise is I recall after Oslo when the I think the guy who threw Leon Klinghoffer off the off of the cruise liner was formally accepted as a resident of the under the Palestinian Authority. And there actually was a moment of saying that was when we were at war, and now we're not in war anymore. So people sometimes surprise me by being
I
capable.
mean, like any organization, there are differences and divisions. And Hamas is caught, I think, particularly the external leadership, caught between the mukawama, the resistance on one hand, which distinguishes Hamas as an organization, and their social and religious outreach, what they call the dawah, the call. Now, is it conceivable that Hamas would make a transformational decision? I don't think there is a leader, externally or internally, that would be willing and or able, basically, to fundamentally transform itself. They said they'll disarm when the Israelis withdraw, and I think they even use the language of a Palestinian state. Well, they continue to aspire to all of Palestine. That's clearly not possible. But clearly, after 2 years, the Israelis have managed to hollow out the organization militarily, but its viability and even its prestige as a preferable security force among many Palestinians to the criminal gangs and the clans, Hamas remains the preeminent political actor in Gaza and security actor in the 47% that they control. I don't see that changing.
Well, Aaron and Suzanne, thank you very much. It isn't your job to make us feel good about the world. It's your job to help us understand what goes on, and you've both done an excellent job of doing that today, for which I'm very grateful. And I'm going to hand you over to Suzanne Borden, who will I think have some questions from people watching.
Yes, thank you very much for explaining all of this to us. There's a lot of questions, and I'll start backwards. You started the conversation about Iran. Several people have asked the question, might the U.S. be waiting to respond because of concern for strikes in Israel?
I mean, I think that it was part of the effort to get more prepared for making good on what the president tweeted, was trying not just to move American military assets in the region, but also to ensure that the Israelis themselves had sufficient Arrow interceptor supply to withstand another potential barrage of Iranian missiles. And so I think there's also a possibility of an Israeli strike on Iran, given that the United States has also moved in a lot of air defense and is looking to ensure that it's prepared to help to withstand any kind of strike on either the bases and other assets that we have in the region or on Israel.
Somebody asked, could Turkey take over Syria and challenge Israel's military? Any thoughts on that?
I mean, look, the Israelis have concerns about Turkish influence in Syria. I'm sure the Israelis are very concerned about the diminishment of the Kurdish, the SDF. I think that Turkey becomes the most important security factor of the Shara government. After all, HTS, which was the Hayat Tahrir Sham, which was Afan Shara's jihadi organization, was the former Nusra, the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, had Turkish backing for what became a 3-week march to Damascus last the fall of December of 2024. But I think the prospect of a military conflict between a member of NATO and America's closest ally in the Middle East probably even weighs heavy on both of them. So I don't foresee the prospects of Israeli-Turkish, maybe by proxies, but not direct conflict in Syria.
Could I
Oh,
just
you want to
add?
say something? Yes, please,
I just
Robert.
wanted to add that it's a founding principle of the Turkish Revolution that created the modern Turkish state not to try to recapture territories that had been part of the Ottoman Empire. It was
Remember this place called Alexandretta.
Alexandria, or yes, there was it is a basic principle of the Turkish state that we used to be a great military power. Look where it got us. Let's make this country work. So
Mustafa Kemal, a great leader.
Mustafa Kemal, yes.
But I would say it's not always clear that that's exactly where Erdogan's head is at this point. I
Yes.
don't imagine him trying to contest the Israeli military, but I do think that the Turks are they have some swagger right now, and they are using their preferential position in Syria in some respects to try to, demonstrate, as my colleague Aslan Tashbash, who had a wonderful piece in the New York Times this weekend on Syria, has written that, Turkey's back in the Middle East in a way that I think is not just incidental and not just circumstantial, but very much part of the Erdogan worldview.
One issue that you guys have not spoken about is Trump's Board of Peace. And I would love both of your thoughts on that. Somebody wanted to know how would this work when you have countries like Qatar and Turkey on that? And what does Israel think of this Board of Peace?
I mean, I again, this is an editorial comment. Having worked and voted for Republicans and Democrats, forgive me. If you look at the countries that have signed up for the Board of Peace, now I think there are 20. They fall into 3 groups. These are my characterization. Number one, friends of the president, Orban of Syria, of Hungary, for example. Countries who want to remain friends of the president for obvious reasons. That would be the state of Israel and some key Gulf countries. But the majority of the countries that have signed up do not have the political, constitutional, or legal processes that would have been required for a country like Britain or France, or I would argue any democratic polity, to sign up for. You've signed up to a board in which the chairman of the board exercises a veto power over all of the resolutions, and committees, an executive committee that nominally is the second highest performer below the actual board itself, and a Gaza committee chosen by the president and his advisors. So I can't imagine. Boards don't negotiate. They don't peacekeep, and they don't provide humanitarian assistance. The UN has many problems and imperfections. This is not going to replace the UN. And as Donald Trump well knows, as he sends his negotiators off to Abu Dhabi and to Oman on Iran, it is mediators that drive agreements, not boards.
Suzanne?
I think what's notable about the Board of Peace is just the corruption element of it, the extent to which this envisions Trump as the president for life and or the head of the board for life, and the expectation of payment that would be solely within the discretion of the leadership of the board. I think the idea of using a vehicle to try to advance outcomes, especially around the Palestinian situation, that invokes and plays upon the credibility and authority of the United Nations, that tries to corral some of those states that might be spoilers if they weren't brought into the process. That's not entirely new. And here I'm borrowing from wisdom of some of my colleagues here at Brookings who pointed out that that's a little bit of what the quartet was intended to do, that we have
Yeah.
at various points in time sought to use ad hoc or conflict-specific multilateral groupings to try to bring in others to manage outcomes. But this one is very Trump-like in many of its characteristics, and so therefore even more destined to fail than perhaps some of the other vehicles we've used.
Several people have asked, why do we not hear more about the violence going on in the West Bank and some solutions to that?
I mean, there's a lot of news coverage. As far as the Trump administration is concerned, they have one red line: do not annex the West Bank. And Benjamin Netanyahu, maybe not Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, but Benjamin Netanyahu got the memo. But they have acquiesced, if not enabled, a set of Israeli policies, which stretch back even before the current Netanyahu government, pursuing policies that are annexationist in everything but name. And this, I think, is one of the problems of Gaza. Even though the 20-point plan talks about Palestinian self-determination and statehood, it essentially compartmentalizes Gaza from events in the West Bank. And it strikes me the Arabs, particularly the Saudis, if Donald Trump didn't understand when Mohammed bin Salman, whom I'm not a great fan of based on his serial human rights violations, but if Donald Trump didn't understand that Mohammed bin Salman, when he left Washington, had no intention of normalizing with the Israelis unless there was a significant ask and lift by the Israelis on the Palestinian issue, he should have gotten the memo, because the Saudis are not willing to be bought so cheaply.
Suzanne, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think I just come back to this question of what Aaron just said and the larger dynamics between the Saudis and Emiratis. There is the potential for this to turn badly in a number of places, but I think it's also, to my mind, almost a normalization of power politics within the Arab world. This sort of presumption that because there is, sort of common regime type or common religion and ethnicity, that there should be a sort of wider alliance. In fact, that there's likely to be rivalries and competition. And so, we've seen, in part because of the Abraham Accords and the progress between around normalization between the Emiratis and Israelis, which is truly extraordinary. I mean, there's such a degree of, both cultural, business, everything. There's so much going on there. That the Saudis are going to demand a higher price, and that they are, as Aaron said, they have a different posture when it comes to the settlement of the Palestinian issue because of their role in the Islamic world.
Thank you. And as we wrap up, we're only in the second month of 2026. What do you think about the year ahead? What will 2026 be known for? Is there any hope for all of us watching? What are your thoughts?
It's not a
Suzanne, you want to go first? Oh, go ahead, Aaron.
It's not a foreign policy comment. It's 2026 will be a determinative year, I think, at least the beginnings of recoveries, in my judgment. And again, I'll say, having voted and worked for Republicans and Democrats, the midterms will be incredibly important here. The first initial step, in my judgment, for a return to restoration of effective self-governance in this country, which will have to involve Republicans and Democrats, and Israeli elections, which may well be the most consequential. in the history of the state, I don't know, Israel's had some pretty extraordinary elections, but it will be a beginning of hopefully leaders and political elites in both countries that can support the democratic character of their respective nations. At least that's my hope.
I will share that hope. I will be, and maybe on a slightly more pessimistic note, which is I just think we're living through an inflection point. 2026, we're only a month in, 5 weeks in, and so much has already happened. The United States is, this posture is not, sort of temporary or unique to this administration. There is a large constituency that does believe in disrupting our traditional alliance networks, and our sense of a world in which there is at least some attempt to impose order on the chaos and on the violence, and that U.S. power and influence it needs to be used in a way to help make the world a better place. I'm not sure that that is a shared value any longer in this country, and I worry about what happens not just in this part of the world, in the Middle East, but also more broadly, if and in fact the United States abdicates that role on a longer term basis.
Suzanne Borden, can I just say thanks to you and to Robert, but also to Suzanne Maloney. I have to say, not only are you an extraordinary analyst, but your sense of history and perspective, I think I learned from you, Suzanne, and for that I am grateful.
Wow. Well, thank you to all of you. And Aaron,
Thank you.
that is high praise coming from someone like you who has made history.
Well, I will echo the thank you to Robert, to Aaron, to Suzanne. I want to thank the audience for watching us. Please go to Moment's website at momentmag.com where you can register for our upcoming programs. I will send a follow-up email with today's program with a link to it so you can share with others. There's a lot to digest here. You may want to watch it again. Again, thank you, everybody, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.